The night my husband asked for a divorce. He didn't look nervous. He looked confident. Christopher stood in the middle of our kitchen with a stack of legal papers in his hand like he had rehearsed the moment 100 times before. The soft glow of the lights above the counter reflected off the polished granite where we had once eaten quiet dinners together. Outside, the Denver skyline flickered in the distance. But inside the house, everything felt strangely still. "I want the house," he said. He didn't hesitate. "The 2 cars? The investment accounts? The rental condo? All of it?" For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. 12 years of marriage, reduced to a list of assets like items in a business contract. Then he added the sentence that made the air in the room feel colder. "You make more money than I do. Megan, you'll recover. Later." My lawyer would beg me not to sign those papers. She would say no rational person would ever agree to a deal like that. She would say the court would never expect me to give away everything I had worked for. But Christopher had already made the worst mistake of his life long before that night. He just didn't know it yet. And when I finally said, "Fine, you can have everything," everyone thought I had lost my mind. Everyone except me. That evening had started like any other. I had just come home from showing 2 luxury properties in Cherry Creek, both of them listed for more money than most people would earn in a lifetime. My job as a real estate broker meant long hours, but I loved the work. Negotiating deals, studying markets, helping clients find homes they had dreamed about for years. It was demanding. But it was also the reason Christopher and I had the life we did. The house we were standing in now had once been my proudest purchase. I had found it myself during a quiet market dip 8 years earlier. A modern home with wide glass windows, clean lines, and a view of the foothills that turned golden every evening at sunset. At the time, Christopher had joked that my instincts were better than most investment firms. "You always know where the value is hiding," he had told me. Back then, I believed we were building something together. Christopher worked as a data analyst for a fast-growing tech company in Denver. He loved numbers, patterns, predictions. The way he talked about algorithms made it sound like the future was something you could map out on a spreadsheet. In the early years of our marriage, that confidence had impressed me. We had been partners then. At least that's what I thought. That night, however, Christopher didn't look like my partner. He looked like someone closing a deal. He placed the folder on the kitchen counter and slid it toward me. The logo of a law firm was printed across the top page in bold letters. I didn't need to open it to understand what it was. "Divorce papers," he said calmly. The word echoed in the quiet kitchen. I leaned against the counter and folded my arms. My heart should have been racing. But strangely, I felt calm. Maybe because part of me had already seen this coming. "When did you decide this?" I asked. Christopher shrugged slightly, like the question wasn't particularly important. "It's been coming for a while." A while. 12 years of marriage reduced to a vague timeline. He continued speaking as if we were discussing office paperwork. "My lawyer already prepared everything. It'll be simple if we both cooperate." Simple. That was the word he kept using. I finally opened the folder and flipped through the pages. Legal language filled the documents. But the meaning was perfectly clear. The house would transfer entirely to Christopher. Both cars. The investment accounts. The rental condo near downtown that I had purchased years earlier. Every major asset we owned. I looked up from the papers slowly. "You want everything?" Christopher nodded as if this were the most reasonable request in the world. "It's practical," he said. "You earn more than I do anyway. Your real estate business is doing great. You'll bounce back." The way he said bounce back made it sound like losing everything was a temporary inconvenience. "And what about you?" I asked. He leaned back slightly against the counter, crossing his arms. "I just want a fresh start." He didn't say Kayla's name. He didn't need to. I had already seen the late-night messages, the sudden work meetings, the strange perfume that lingered on his clothes one evening when he came home after midnight. Kayla Bennett, 31 years old, a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic across town, young, energetic, ambitious, Christopher had thought he was careful. But people who believe they are the smartest person in the room often forget how much they reveal without realizing it. Still, I didn't confront him about her. Not that night. Instead, I studied him quietly. Christopher looked confident. Too confident. The kind of confidence people have when they believe they are one step ahead of everyone else. "You really think I'll just sign this?" I said. He shrugged again. "I think you'll see that it makes sense." His certainty almost made me smile. Because what Christopher didn't understand was that this conversation wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of one that had started 3 years earlier. 3 years earlier, I had discovered something about Christopher's finances that changed the way I saw my husband forever. Something hidden beneath the surface of the life we had built together. Something Christopher believed I would never find. And as I stood there in the kitchen that night, looking down at the papers that would supposedly give him everything, I realized something else. If Christopher truly wanted every asset we owned, I wasn't going to stop him. In fact, I was going to make it very easy for him. Because sometimes the smartest way to win a game isn't by fighting your opponent. Sometimes you simply let them take the entire board and wait for them to realize what they've just inherited. For a long time, people believed Christopher and I had the kind of marriage everyone wanted. If you had seen us at one of the neighborhood dinners or charity events in Denver, you probably would have thought the same thing. We had the house with the glass walls and mountain views. We drove the kind of cars that made people glance twice in parking lots. We hosted quiet dinner parties where our friends talked about investments, tech startups, and real estate markets over expensive wine. From the outside, everything about our life looked stable, successful, almost perfect. Christopher and I had met when we were both still trying to build our careers. I was just beginning my work as a real estate agent, spending my weekends driving clients through neighborhoods and studying housing trends late at night. Christopher had already started his career as a data analyst for a technology company downtown. Numbers fascinated him. He loved the idea that patterns in data could predict what the future would look like. In those early years, I admired that about him. He had this quiet confidence, the kind that made you feel safe making big decisions. When we talked about money or investments, Christopher spoke like someone who could see opportunities other people overlooked. We believed we were building something together. When my real estate business finally started gaining momentum, the first major decision we made as a couple was buying a house. Denver's market was unpredictable at the time, but I had been studying the patterns closely. I knew certain neighborhoods were about to explode in value. Christopher trusted my instincts. Go with your gut, he told me one night while we were looking at listings on my laptop. You've never been wrong about property before. A few weeks later, we closed on the house that would become our home for the next 8 years. At the time, it felt like proof that we were moving forward together. My career continued growing after that. Luxury real estate in Denver was booming, and I built relationships with clients who trusted me with properties worth millions. Every successful sale pushed us further into financial comfort. Christopher was proud of me then. Whenever friends asked how we were doing so well, he always smiled and said the same thing. Megan knows how to find value before anyone else does. For a while, it really did feel like a partnership. But money changes people in ways that aren't always obvious at first. Christopher began taking more interest in the financial side of our lives as our income grew. At first, I welcomed it. It felt good to have someone equally invested in planning our future. He started analyzing investment opportunities the same way he analyzed data at work. He built spreadsheets comparing markets, calculated long-term returns, and talked about how small decisions now could shape our financial freedom later. Sometimes we would sit at the kitchen table late at night reviewing numbers together. Imagine where we'll be in 10 years, he said once, tapping his laptop screen where he had built a complicated projection chart. I remember laughing. As long as we're not living in spreadsheets, I joked. Christopher grinned. No chance. I'm building us a life. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything began to shift. The more money we made, the more Christopher became fascinated with the idea of multiplying it quickly. My approach to wealth had always been patient. Real estate taught you that value grew slowly but reliably. Christopher, however, began thinking differently. He started reading financial blogs and tech investment forums late at night, articles about startup companies, cryptocurrency markets, and disruptive technologies filled his browser history. At first, I thought it was just curiosity, but curiosity slowly turned into obsession. Christopher started talking about early-stage startups that could become billion-dollar companies. He explained blockchain technology to me like it was the foundation of a new financial world. He talked about artificial intelligence companies that were supposedly about to transform entire industries. His excitement was contagious at first. "You know what the biggest mistake investors make?" he said one night while pacing across the living room. "They wait too long. By the time everyone believes in something, the real money has already been made." I listened, but something about the intensity in his voice made me uneasy. Christopher wasn't just interested in investing anymore. He sounded like someone chasing something. Still, I trusted him. That trust was the reason I didn't question the first few financial decisions he made. When he mentioned putting money into a small technology startup he believed in, I assumed he had researched it carefully. After all, analyzing data was literally his job. "This company is going to change the industry," he told me confidently. "How do you know?" I asked. Christopher smiled the way he always did when he believed he had discovered something special. "The data tells the story." I didn't argue. In fact, I supported him. Marriage meant believing in each other's instincts. And Christopher had always been intelligent and careful with numbers. But over time, I started noticing small changes in him. Christopher stayed up later and later working on his laptop. When I woke up in the middle of the night, I often found him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by charts and financial reports. Sometimes I asked what he was working on. "Just research," he said. Other times he barely looked up from the screen. "I'm close to something big." The strange part was how confident he sounded every time he said that, as if the future he was building already existed somewhere just beyond our reach. What I didn't realize at the time was that Christopher wasn't just studying investments anymore. He was slowly building a financial world that even I didn't fully understand. And the deeper he went into it, the less he seemed to care about the life we had already built together. The first real argument we had about money happened about 3 years before the night he asked for a divorce. Christopher wanted to take a large loan to fund one of the technology investments he believed in. He explained it quickly, using complex financial terms and projections that made the opportunity sound almost guaranteed. "This is temporary leverage," he said. "Once the company grows, the returns will cover everything." I remember standing in the kitchen listening to him and feeling a small knot form in my stomach. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. Christopher didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." At the time, I wanted to believe him. But something about the way he spoke that night stayed with me. It was the first moment I realized Christopher wasn't just investing anymore. He was gambling on a future he believed only he could see. The first time I realized something was wrong with Christopher's finances, it wasn't because of a bill or a bank notice. It was because of silence. For years, Christopher had always been open about money. We talked about investments, savings, and financial goals almost casually. Numbers had always been part of our daily life. But sometime around 3 years before our divorce, that transparency quietly disappeared. At first it was subtle. Christopher stopped mentioning the investments he used to talk about constantly. The late-night research sessions continued. But when I asked what he was working on, the answers became shorter. Just some market analysis. Nothing major. Work stuff? He said it with the kind of casual tone that made it sound like I was asking unnecessary questions. I told myself I was imagining things. Marriage changes over time. People grow busy. Careers become more demanding. It was easy to believe that his silence meant nothing. But then the mail started arriving. Most of our financial statements were electronic by that point, so physical mail had become rare. When something did appear in the mailbox, it usually meant it was important. One afternoon I came home early from a showing and sorted through the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. One of them caught my attention immediately. The envelope was from a bank I didn't recognize. At first I assumed it was just another marketing offer. Banks send those constantly. Credit cards, loan promotions, refinancing deals. But when I opened it, the letter inside didn't look like advertising. It was a confirmation notice. A line of credit had been approved. The amount printed on the page made my stomach tighten. $300,000. I read the letter again. Slower this time. The account holder's name was Christopher Carter. For a moment I just stood there in the quiet kitchen staring at the document. Christopher and I shared most of our financial information. We had never hidden major accounts from each other before. If he had opened a new line of credit that large, I should have known about it. But I didn't. I placed the letter back in the envelope and set it on the counter. When Christopher came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the document in front of me. He noticed it immediately. His expression changed for just a fraction of a second. Then the confident smile returned. "Oh," he said casually. "You saw that?" I watched him carefully. "You opened a $300,000 line of credit." Christopher pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "It's not what it looks like," he said. That sentence rarely leads to reassuring explanations. "So what is it?" I asked. Christopher leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice like he was about to reveal something exciting. "It's leverage." The word hung in the air between us. He explained quickly, the way he always did when he believed he had already solved a problem. "The line of credit," he said, "was temporary. He was using it to invest in a startup company he believed had enormous potential. According to the data he had analyzed, the company's technology could become extremely valuable within a few years. This is how serious investors operate," he told me. "You use leverage to accelerate growth." I listened without interrupting. The explanation sounded polished, but something about it felt incomplete. "How much money have you already invested?" I asked. Christopher hesitated. "Not that much." The pause told me more than the answer. "Christopher," he leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, Megan, you deal with property. Real estate moves slowly. Technology is different. When you see an opportunity early, you have to move fast. And borrowing $300,000 is moving fast." His tone shifted slightly, becoming defensive. "It's not reckless if the data supports it." I didn't argue further that night. Instead, I asked one simple question. "Did you use the house as collateral?" Christopher's eyes flickered for a moment. "It's standard for credit approvals," he said carefully. The knot in my stomach tightened. Our house was worth nearly $1 million at that point. It had always been our most stable asset. Hearing that it was connected to a line of credit I didn't know about made the room feel smaller. "Christopher," I said quietly, "we should talk about major financial decisions before they happen." "I am talking about it," he replied quickly. After the fact, his jaw tightened slightly. "You're overreacting? Maybe I was. Or maybe that was the moment the foundation of our marriage started cracking." Over the next few months, I tried to pay closer attention to our finances. Christopher became noticeably more protective of certain details. Bank statements that used to arrive openly in our shared email accounts now appeared only in his personal inbox. Whenever I asked about specific investments, his answers remained vague. "The markets fluctuate. I'm adjusting positions. Trust me. Trust me." The phrase began appearing more and more often in our conversations. Eventually, curiosity turned into concern. One evening while Christopher was out of town for a conference, I sat alone in our home office reviewing the financial records we still shared access to. What I found that night changed everything. The $300,000 credit line had only been the beginning. There were additional loans, smaller ones at first, then larger ones, each tied to different investments Christopher had made over the past 2 years. Startup funding, cryptocurrency purchases, technology venture capital opportunities. At first, the numbers looked manageable, but as I continued reviewing the records, the total amount kept growing and growing until the final figure appeared on the spreadsheet I had built while tracing every loan. credit line, and refinancing document I could find. $2.9 million. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the number glowing on the laptop screen. Christopher hadn't just taken a few risks. He had built an entire financial structure based on borrowed money. And the most terrifying part was how he had secured those loans. Many of them were tied directly to assets we owned together. The house, the investment accounts, even the rental property downtown. If something went wrong with those investments, the consequences wouldn't just affect Christopher. They would destroy everything we had built. That was the night I realized something important about my husband. Christopher wasn't simply making bold financial decisions. He was hiding the scale of his risks. And the deeper I looked into the numbers, the more I understood one terrifying truth. Christopher believed he was playing a game he could not lose. But the board he had built was far more dangerous than he realized. For several days after discovering the loans, I didn't say a word to Christopher. I went to work like usual. I showed houses. I negotiated contracts. I smiled during client meetings and talked about square footage, market appreciation, and closing timelines as if nothing in my life had changed. But every night when I returned home, the same number echoed quietly in my mind. $2.9 million. The number felt unreal at first. I kept telling myself I must have misunderstood something in the documents. Maybe some of the loans were temporary. Maybe some had already been repaid. But the more I reviewed the financial records, the clearer the truth became. Christopher had been building a tower of debt, and that tower was balanced on top of our shared assets. The house, the rental condo, our investment accounts, even some lines of credit tied to the equity and properties I had purchased. I spent several evenings carefully tracing every document I could find. As a real estate broker, I had spent years reviewing contracts and financial disclosures. Reading complex paperwork wasn't new to me, but this time the documents weren't about a client's property. They were about my life. Christopher had taken out multiple loans through different banks. Some were business loans connected to small technology ventures he had invested in. Others were personal lines of credit used to purchase cryptocurrency or fund startup projects. He had refinanced earlier loans to create room for new ones. Each decision seemed logical on its own, but together they created something dangerous. A chain reaction waiting for the wrong market movement. The part that frightened me most wasn't the debt itself. It was how carefully Christopher had hidden it. Most of the documents were filed through accounts connected only to his name. Some were routed through digital statements instead of physical mail. Several loans had been approved using the value of our properties as collateral without appearing directly in our shared accounts. Christopher hadn't been reckless. He had been strategic, and that meant he understood exactly how risky the situation was. I closed my laptop late one night and sat in the quiet living room staring out through the tall windows that overlooked the city lights of Denver. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I was looking at my husband as a stranger. Christopher wasn't just chasing financial success anymore. He was gambling with our entire future, and he believed I would never notice. A week later, something else happened that made the situation even clearer. Christopher started coming home later. At first it was small things. A dinner meeting with coworkers, a project deadline that required overtime, a networking event with other tech professionals. I had heard all of those explanations before over the years, so I didn't question them immediately. But gradually the pattern became obvious. Christopher's phone buzzed constantly. Sometimes he stepped outside to take calls. Other times he carried his laptop into the spare bedroom and closed the door for long periods of time. One evening I walked past the room while he was inside and heard him laughing. Not the polite laughter he used during business calls. Something lighter, more relaxed. When he emerged a few minutes later, he looked surprised to see me standing in the hallway. "Long call?" I asked. Christopher nodded quickly. "Just work stuff." But the faint scent of perfume in the air told a different story. A few days later, the truth became impossible to ignore. I was sitting in a cafe downtown between property showings when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was a client. But when I opened the message, there was no text, just a photograph. The image showed Christopher sitting at a restaurant table. Across from him was a woman I had never seen before. They were leaning close together, laughing about something. The angle of the photo suggested it had been taken discreetly from across the room. Underneath the image was a short message. "Thought you should know." There was no name attached. I stared at the picture for a long time. The woman looked younger than me, maybe early 30s. Her long brown hair was tied loosely behind her shoulders, and she wore the kind of confident smile that suggested she believed she belonged exactly where she was. Christopher looked relaxed, comfortable, like someone who had nothing to hide. But the hand resting casually on the table between them told me everything I needed to know. I didn't reply to the message. Instead, I saved the photograph and returned my attention to the property documents in front of me. Because by that point, the betrayal itself was no longer the most surprising part of the story. Christopher was cheating on me, but he was also drowning in hidden debt. And somehow those two facts felt connected. Later that evening, I decided to confirm what I already suspected. It didn't take long. A quick search through social media profiles revealed the woman's identity. Kayla Bennett, 31 years old, a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic in Denver. Her public photos showed her hiking in the mountains, attending fitness events, and smiling in bright, carefully staged pictures that captured the image of someone energetic and ambitious. Christopher appeared in none of those photos, but the timestamps told their own story. Several of the pictures had been posted on evenings Christopher had claimed he was working late. For a moment, I felt the familiar sting of betrayal that most people feel when they discover something like this. But that feeling passed quickly, because the larger problem was already sitting on my laptop screen back at home. $2.9 million. Christopher believed he was building a new life. A younger girlfriend. A fresh start. A future funded by risky investments he believed would eventually pay off. What he didn't realize was how fragile that future actually was. And more importantly, he didn't realize that I had already seen the entire financial structure behind it. For several minutes, I sat quietly in the cafe, watching people pass by the window outside. Then I opened my phone and looked again at the photo of Christopher and Kayla. If Christopher wanted to destroy our marriage, that was his decision. But if he thought he could walk away from everything we had built without consequences, he was making a much bigger mistake. Because the moment I discovered the truth about his finances and his affair, something inside me shifted. I stopped thinking like a wife, and started thinking like someone who understood exactly how dangerous his game had become. Christopher believed he was the smartest person in the room, but he had forgotten something very important. I had been studying markets, contracts, and financial leverage for most of my career, and if there was one thing my profession had taught me, it was this: every asset comes with hidden obligations, and sometimes the most valuable move you can make is letting someone else take ownership of everything. I didn't confront Christopher about Kayla. Not that night. Not the next day. Not even the week after that. Instead, I did something Christopher never expected. I started preparing. For the next several weeks, I watched him carefully. Not in an emotional way. Not like someone trying to catch a cheating husband in the act. I watched him the way I watched markets when a property deal started to feel unstable. Quietly, patiently, observing every pattern. Christopher's behavior changed slowly, but once I paid attention, the signs were impossible to miss. He spent more time on his phone than he ever had before. Sometimes he smiled while reading messages, the kind of small private smile people don't realize they're showing. Other times he stepped outside to take calls he didn't want me to hear. The nights he came home late became more frequent. At first he used the same explanations: work meeting, client dinner, tech conference planning. But eventually he stopped trying very hard to make the stories believable. And the strange thing was that I stopped pretending to believe them. Our house became quieter. Conversations between us grew shorter and more practical. We talked about groceries, bills, schedules, the kind of neutral topics couples use when they are slowly drifting apart, but haven't acknowledged it yet. Christopher probably thought I was becoming passive, maybe even weak. What he didn't understand was that I had already begun reorganizing my entire financial life. The first thing I did was open a private account. As a real estate broker, my income didn't arrive in neat monthly paychecks. Commissions came in waves, sometimes large ones, depending on the timing of property sales. Over the next several months, I quietly redirected part of those commissions into the new account. Not large amounts that would attract attention, just small transfers that slowly accumulated. Christopher never noticed. He had stopped reviewing our joint financial summaries carefully a long time ago. His attention was focused somewhere else now, his investments, his new relationship, the future he believed was waiting for him. The second thing I did was review every document connected to our assets. I already knew about the loans Christopher had taken, but I wanted to understand exactly how those loans were structured. Late at night, after Christopher had fallen asleep, I sat in the office reviewing contracts and bank disclosures. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. Christopher had used our house as collateral for several refinancing agreements. He had secured business loans tied to the rental condo I owned downtown. Even some of the credit lines connected to our investment accounts had been expanded through property equity. In other words, the assets Christopher believed made him wealthy were directly connected to the debts he had created. It was a complicated structure, but the principle behind it was simple. Whoever controlled those assets would also inherit the financial obligations attached to them. When I realized that, something inside me went completely calm. Christopher thought he was asking for everything in the divorce, but he had no idea what everything actually meant. About 2 months after I first discovered the loans, I met with a financial advisor I had worked with years earlier for one of my property clients. We met in a quiet office downtown. I needed advice about asset separation. I told him. He reviewed the documents I had brought and frowned slightly as he read through them. "These loans are significant," he said. "I know. Your husband approved them without consulting you." "Yes." He looked up at me over the papers. "You realize that if these investments fail, the liability could extend to the shared assets." "That's exactly what I want to understand." The advisor studied me for a moment. "You're planning something," he said slowly. I didn't answer directly. "I'm planning to protect what's mine." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then you need to separate your personal finances as cleanly as possible." Over the next several weeks, I followed his advice carefully. I moved my personal savings into accounts that existed only in my name. Some of my long-term investments were transferred into a retirement fund that legally couldn't be connected to marital assets. Even a small inheritance from my parents, money I had always kept separate but never formally isolated, was placed into a protected trust account. Every step was legal. Every step was quiet. Christopher never noticed any of it. His world was moving in a completely different direction. One evening I was working late in the living room when Christopher walked in after 10 o'clock. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and restaurant food. "Busy day?" he asked casually. "Always," I said. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat across from me. "You've been working a lot lately," he said. "So have you—" He smiled slightly. "That's temporary." Something about the way he said it made me pause. "Temporary?" Christopher leaned back in his chair. "Things are going to change soon." The confidence in his voice felt familiar. It was the same tone he used when talking about investment opportunities he believed would make him rich. "Change how?" I asked. "You'll see." He didn't elaborate further. But the way he looked at me told me everything. Christopher had already decided to leave the marriage. Kayla was probably already part of that future he imagined. He just hadn't told me yet. I watched him finish his wine and walk upstairs without another word. For a moment I sat quietly in the dim light of the living room. Then I opened my laptop and reviewed the spreadsheet I had built, tracing Christopher's debts. $2.9 million. Every loan, every credit line, every refinancing agreement, all tied directly to the assets he believed he was about to claim. Christopher thought he was planning his escape. What he didn't realize was that the trap he had built for himself was already complete. And when the time came for him to demand everything in the divorce, I wasn't going to argue. I was going to let him have exactly what he asked for. Christopher told me he wanted a divorce on a quiet Tuesday evening. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No shouting. No slammed doors. No emotional speeches. Just a calm conversation in the same kitchen where we had spent years planning a future together. I had just finished reviewing a property contract when he walked in and placed a folder on the counter. His expression was steady, almost rehearsed. "I think it's time we ended this," he said. For a moment, I simply looked at him. Not surprised. Not angry. Just curious to see how he would explain it. Christopher leaned against the counter as if this were a business discussion. "We've grown apart," he continued. "It happens." The explanation sounded polished. The kind of sentence people repeat when they've already justified their decision 100 times in their head. I closed the laptop slowly. "Is that the reason?" I asked. Christopher hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "It's the honest one." I nodded slightly, as if considering the idea. By that point, I already knew about Kayla. I knew about the late-night dinners, the private messages, the weekends Christopher claimed he was traveling for work. But I didn't mention her. Christopher seemed relieved by that. He pushed the folder closer to me. "My lawyer prepared everything already," he said. "It'll make the process easier." I opened the folder and scanned the first few pages. Divorce paperwork, asset division agreements, legal language outlining who would receive what once the marriage was dissolved. Christopher had come prepared. Very prepared. "What exactly do you want?" I asked. Christopher crossed his arms casually. "The house," he said. The words came without hesitation. "The cars. The investment accounts. The rental property downtown." He paused briefly. "Basically everything." For a moment the room was completely silent. I could almost hear the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind us. "You want all the assets," I said. Christopher nodded. "It makes sense." His tone was calm. "Logical? You're the one with the higher income. Megan, your real estate business is doing great. You can rebuild faster than I can." Rebuild. The word sounded almost generous, as if he were offering me an opportunity rather than taking something away. "And you?" I asked. Christopher shrugged. "I just want a clean break." I studied him quietly. The confidence in his posture told me he believed this conversation would end quickly. He expected resistance, maybe some emotional arguments, but nothing that would change the outcome. Christopher believed the situation was already under his control. "What about the debt?" I asked. His expression shifted slightly. "What debt?" I watched his reaction carefully. "The loans tied to the house. The investment financing." Christopher waved his hand dismissively. "That's temporary leverage. The investments will cover everything." Of course they would. In Christopher's mind, they always would. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if explaining something obvious. "Look, Megan, I know this sounds unfair, but realistically you're in a better position to recover. Your career is stronger. You have clients, property connections, commissions coming in." He smiled faintly. "You'll land on your feet." The strange thing was that he believed he was being reasonable. Christopher wasn't asking for everything because he wanted to punish me. He was asking for everything because he believed he deserved it, and because he believed I would accept it. I closed the folder slowly. "What does your lawyer think about this arrangement?" I asked. Christopher shrugged. He said, "If you agree, the court will approve it." Of course the lawyer had said that. If both parties signed willingly, the court rarely questioned the details. Christopher straightened slightly, watching my reaction. "You don't have to decide right now," he said. "But it's the simplest way to finish things quickly." Simple. That word again. The situation would have been simple if Christopher understood the financial structure he had created. But he didn't. He believed the house was worth nearly $1 million. He believed the rental condo generated stable income. He believed the investment accounts contained valuable assets that would grow over time. Christopher saw wealth. He didn't see the obligations attached to it. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. I could have explained the spreadsheet I had built. The loans. The refinancing agreements. The total debt quietly attached to every asset he was asking for. But I didn't. Instead, I asked one final question. If I sign this, I said calmly, you take full ownership of everything. Christopher nodded. Yes. And the financial responsibility connected to those assets. He looked slightly annoyed now. That's how ownership works. I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I closed the folder and slid it back toward him. Okay, I said. Christopher blinked. Okay. I'll sign. For the first time since the conversation began, his confidence faltered slightly. You mean, you agree? Yes. The surprise on his face was almost subtle. Christopher had expected resistance. Arguments. Lawyers negotiating back and forth for weeks. But I was offering him exactly what he wanted. Are you sure? He asked. I am. He studied me carefully now, as if trying to understand what he might be missing. Your lawyer probably won't like it, he said. That's fine. Christopher slowly smiled. A satisfied, relieved smile. Then this will be easier than I expected. He gathered the papers back into the folder and stood up. We'll finalize everything in court, he said. As he walked toward the stairs, he looked almost excited. Christopher believed he had just secured the perfect outcome. A divorce without conflict. A clean financial victory. A future where he walked away with the house, the cars, the investments, and the property he believed represented success. At the top of the staircase, he turned back briefly. I appreciate you making this easy, he said. I nodded politely. Of course. Christopher disappeared into the hallway upstairs. A few seconds later, I heard the bedroom door close. I remained standing in the quiet kitchen. Then I walked to the counter and opened my laptop again. The spreadsheet appeared instantly. Every loan, every credit line, every financial obligation tied to the assets Christopher had just claimed. The final number glowed quietly on the screen. $2.9 million. Christopher believed he had just won the negotiation. What he didn't realize was that the real transaction hadn't even happened yet. And when the court finalized the divorce agreement, Christopher wouldn't just receive the assets he wanted. He would inherit every dollar of the debt attached to them. My lawyer stared at me like I had just suggested something completely insane. We were sitting in her office 2 days after Christopher handed me the divorce papers. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking downtown Denver. But the calm view outside didn't match the tension inside the room. You cannot be serious. Megan. Her name was Laura Simmons, and she had been recommended to me years earlier by a client who specialized in financial law. Laura had handled dozens of divorce cases, many of them complicated by business assets and investment portfolios. But even she looked stunned as she read the agreement Christopher's lawyer had prepared. He wants the house, she said slowly, turning the pages again. Both vehicles, the investment accounts, the rental condo. Laura lowered the document and looked directly at me. And you're telling me you're willing to give him everything? Yes. Laura leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. No. Absolutely not. Her voice carried the kind of firm certainty that comes from years of experience. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, she continued, which means the court expects assets to be divided fairly between both spouses. I know. You are entitled to at least half of everything. Possibly more. I know. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why would you voluntarily sign away assets worth over $1 million? I folded my hands calmly on the table. Because it's the simplest solution. She gave me a look that made it clear she didn't believe that explanation for a second. No one voluntarily walks away from this much property unless there's something else happening. But I didn't say that yet. Laura turned the pages again, studying the financial disclosures attached to the agreement. Her brow furrowed slightly as she reviewed the numbers. Your husband's lawyer included the mortgage obligations, she said quietly. Yes. And several business loans tied to the property. Yes. She looked up again, her expression changing. Do you understand that whoever takes the house and the investments also takes responsibility for the associated debt? Yes. Laura stared at me for several seconds. Then she leaned forward slowly. You already knew that. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed a printed spreadsheet on the desk in front of her. Laura picked it up and began reading. At first, her expression remained neutral. Then her eyes widened slightly. Where did you get this? I built it. The spreadsheet listed every financial obligation Christopher had created over the past 3 years. Mortgage refinancing, business investment loans, credit lines secured through property equity, crypto purchase financing, startup funding agreements. Each entry included the lender, the amount borrowed, and the asset used as collateral. Laura flipped to the final page. The total number was printed clearly at the bottom. $2. 900. 000. She looked up at me slowly. He borrowed all of this. Yes. And the loans are tied to your shared assets. Yes. Laura leaned back in her chair again. But this time her reaction was very different. This changes everything. She scanned the document once more, shaking her head slightly. Your husband's lawyer probably doesn't even realize the full extent of this. I don't think Christopher fully realizes it either, I said. Laura placed the papers down carefully. If he takes full ownership of the assets, she said slowly, then, legally, he also assumes responsibility for the debts secured by them. Correct? And if the investments fail, he owns the consequences. Laura studied me carefully. You've been planning this. I shrugged slightly. I've been preparing. The difference between the two mattered. Planning implied revenge. Preparation implied survival. Laura was silent for a moment as she considered the situation. Finally, she spoke again. You understand that if we challenge the agreement, the court will likely force a more balanced division. Yes. You could walk away with half the assets and avoid the debt entirely. I know. So why let him take everything? I looked out the window briefly at the Denver skyline. Because Christopher believed the assets were worth far more than they actually were. Because he thought he was walking away with wealth. Because he had spent 3 years building a financial trap without realizing it. But the real answer was much simpler. Because it's exactly what he wants, I said. Laura's expression softened slightly. You're very calm about this. I've had 3 years to think about it. She nodded slowly. Then let's talk strategy. For the next hour, we reviewed the agreement in detail. Laura explained exactly how the legal transfer would work if I signed Christopher's proposal. The court would recognize him as the sole owner of the assets listed in the divorce settlement, which meant he would also become the sole party responsible for the financial obligations connected to them. As long as the paperwork clearly states the asset transfer, Laura said. The debt obligations follow ownership. Exactly. But we need to be careful, she continued. Every detail has to be documented properly. If there's any ambiguity, the lenders could still pursue you. I understand. Laura began making notes on the agreement. We'll make sure the transfer language is airtight. She looked up again. Once the judge approves the settlement, you will have no legal responsibility for those loans. That's the goal. Laura leaned back again, this time with a faint smile. I have to admit something, she said. What? This might be the most patient divorce strategy I've ever seen. I raised an eyebrow. It's not a strategy. Then what is it? I thought about Christopher's confident expression the night he handed me the divorce papers. The way he believed he had already won. It's just giving someone exactly what they asked for. Laura closed the folder containing the agreement. Then the next step is the final hearing. About 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Christopher believed he was 6 weeks away from owning everything we had built together. What he didn't realize was that those 6 weeks would only finalize something that had already been decided long ago. Because the moment I discovered the truth about his finances, the outcome of this divorce had already been written. Christopher just hadn't read the full contract yet. The 6 weeks before the final court hearing passed more quietly than I expected. Christopher behaved as if the divorce had already been settled. The house felt less like a shared home, and more like a temporary waiting room where 2 people happened to live under the same roof. We spoke politely, but rarely about anything personal. Most conversations were short and practical. Did the utility bill get paid? Your package arrived. I'll be late tonight. Christopher seemed almost relieved by the lack of conflict. He had probably expected arguments, emotional breakdowns, long discussions about fairness and betrayal. Instead, I stayed calm. From his perspective, that calmness looked like acceptance. From mine, it was preparation. Christopher spent more and more time away from the house during those weeks. Some nights he didn't return until well after midnight. Other evenings he left right after dinner, saying he had meetings with coworkers or networking events for his industry. I never asked questions. There was no point. I already knew where he was going. One Saturday afternoon, I was reviewing property listings in the living room when Christopher walked in, carrying a shopping bag from a furniture store. He set it down on the kitchen counter. "Kayla likes modern designs," he said casually, as if mentioning the weather. I looked up slowly. "You're redecorating?" Christopher shrugged. Eventually. The way he said it made it clear he was already imagining the house as his future home with someone else. He didn't even seem to notice that he had said her name out loud. Kayla. The woman who believed she was about to move into this house. I closed my laptop. "You've made plans already." Christopher leaned against the counter. We both knew this was coming. He wasn't wrong. But the version of the future he believed in was very different from the one I had already accepted. Christopher glanced around the room, almost thoughtfully. "This place has good potential," he said. "It just needs a few changes." I nodded. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." The conversation ended there. He carried the bag upstairs without another word. A few days later, I saw Kayla for the first time in person. Not intentionally. I was leaving a property showing near a rehabilitation clinic when I noticed Christopher's car parked across the street. Curiosity made me slow down. Through the window of a nearby cafe, I saw them sitting together at a small table. Kayla looked exactly like her photos. Young, confident, the kind of energy people often mistake for certainty about the future. Christopher leaned toward her while speaking. His posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. At one point, Kayla laughed and reached across the table to touch his hand. Christopher smiled the way people do when they believe they've finally escaped something. I stood on the sidewalk watching them for a few seconds. Then I walked away. Not because it hurt, but because the situation had already moved beyond emotions. Christopher believed he was building a new life. A younger partner. A house that represented success. A future funded by investments he still believed would eventually make him wealthy. Kayla believed she was stepping into that life. Neither of them understood the full structure beneath it. That evening, Christopher came home earlier than usual. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful. "Court dates next week," he said while opening the refrigerator. "I know. You still okay with the agreement?" "Yes." Christopher glanced at me, perhaps searching for hesitation. He didn't find any good, he said. Then he opened a bottle of wine and poured himself a glass. "To new beginnings," he said lightly. I watched him raise the glass to his lips. The phrase sounded optimistic, hopeful. But the phrase meant something very different to each of us. Christopher believed he was celebrating freedom. I was celebrating something else entirely. A few days later, my lawyer called to confirm the final details. "The judge will review the settlement and confirm the asset transfer," Laura said. "And once that happens, the ownership changes immediately." I sat quietly for a moment. "And the debt obligations? They transfer with the assets, exactly as planned." Christopher would receive the house, the vehicles, the rental property, the investment accounts, everything he had asked for. But he would also inherit every financial obligation tied to them. Every mortgage, every loan, every line of credit secured against those properties. $2.9 million? All of it. The night before the court hearing, Christopher barely spoke to me. He spent most of the evening on his phone, smiling occasionally while typing messages. I didn't need to see the screen to know who he was talking to. At one point, he glanced toward me. "You nervous about tomorrow?" he asked. "No," Christopher nodded. "Good." He seemed satisfied with that answer. satisfied that everything was going exactly the way he expected. Later that night, I walked through the house one last time. The living room where we had hosted friends. The kitchen where we had planned our future. The tall windows overlooking the lights of Denver. Christopher believed he was about to become the sole owner of all of it. Kayla probably believed the same thing. But ownership meant more than possession. Ownership meant responsibility. And the moment the judge approved the divorce settlement the next day, Christopher wouldn't just gain the life he thought he wanted. He would inherit every hidden weight holding that life together. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. Divorce hearings are rarely dramatic. There are no long speeches. No sudden confessions like the ones you see in movies. Most of the time they are brief. Procedural. Almost routine. That morning felt exactly like that. Christopher arrived before me, sitting confidently beside his lawyer at one of the wooden tables near the front of the room. He wore the same dark suit he usually chose for important work meetings. His posture relaxed, his expression calm. When he noticed me enter, he gave a polite nod. Not cold, not warm, just professional. As if we were two people finishing a business arrangement rather than ending a 12-year marriage. I took a seat beside Laura. She leaned slightly toward me. "You still certain?" she whispered. "Yes." Laura studied my face for a moment, searching for doubt. She didn't find any. Across the room, Christopher's lawyer appeared equally confident. The man was older, experienced, with the steady demeanor of someone who had handled countless cases like this before. From his perspective, the situation probably looked simple. Both spouses had agreed to the asset division. No disputes. No conflict. Just paperwork waiting for a judge's approval. Kayla was there too. She sat quietly in the back row, dressed in a light blue dress that made her look younger than her 31 years. She didn't look nervous. If anything, she looked curious, occasionally glancing toward Christopher with a faint smile. Christopher noticed her once and returned the smile briefly before turning his attention back to the front of the courtroom. That small exchange told me everything I needed to know. In Christopher's mind, the future had already begun. After a few minutes, the judge entered the room. Everyone stood. The hearing began almost immediately. The judge reviewed the file briefly, flipping through the documents that outlined the divorce agreement. His expression remained neutral as he read. "Christopher Carter and Megan Carter," he said, glancing up. "Yes, Your Honor," both lawyers responded. The judge continued reviewing the paperwork. "I see that both parties have agreed to a voluntary settlement regarding marital assets." "That is correct," Laura said. Christopher's lawyer nodded as well. "The agreement transfers ownership of the primary residence, the two vehicles, the rental property, and associated investment accounts to Mr. Carter." The judge looked toward Christopher. "Is that correct?" "Mr. Carter." Christopher straightened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." "And Mrs. Carter, you understand that you are relinquishing your claim to these assets voluntarily?" "Yes." The judge paused for a moment. "You have reviewed this agreement with legal counsel?" "I have." "And you are signing this settlement willingly?" "Yes." For a brief moment, the judge studied both of us. Then he nodded and continued reading through the financial disclosure section of the documents. This part took longer. Much longer. The courtroom remained silent except for the sound of pages turning. Finally, the judge placed the papers down. "Before approving the settlement," he said, "I want to confirm the associated financial obligations attached to these assets." Christopher's lawyer leaned forward slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge glanced down again at the documents. The mortgage on the primary residence is listed at approximately $1.5 million. Christopher's expression didn't change. He already knew about the mortgage. The judge continued. "There are also business loans secured against the property and investment accounts." Christopher shifted slightly in his seat, probably not expecting that part to be emphasized. The judge kept reading. "Additionally, there are several lines of credit and personal loans tied to the assets being transferred." Christopher's lawyer leaned forward, scanning the document again. For the first time, his confident posture changed. "Your Honor," he began carefully. But the judge continued reading. "The total combined financial obligations attached to the transferred assets appear to be approximately $2.9 million. The room felt suddenly smaller. Christopher's lawyer froze for a moment. Then he quickly flipped through the documents again, his expression tightening. He leaned toward Christopher and whispered something urgently. Christopher frowned. "What?" he murmured quietly. The lawyer turned another page, reading faster now. Color drained slowly from his face. "Christopher," he whispered again, this time louder. Christopher's confident posture began to shift. "What is it?" he asked under his breath. The lawyer looked at him directly. "You're assuming full liability for these debts." Christopher blinked. "What debts?" The lawyer slid the document in front of him. "All of them." Christopher stared at the page. For a few seconds he didn't move. Then he began scanning the numbers. The mortgage, the business loans, the credit lines, the investment financing. Each line added another weight to the total. $2.9 million. Christopher looked up slowly, confusion spreading across his face. "That can't be right." His lawyer spoke quietly but firmly. "It's in the settlement agreement." Christopher's eyes widened. "I thought the debts are secured by the assets." The lawyer interrupted. Christopher turned toward the judge. "Your Honor." But the judge raised a hand calmly. "Mr. Carter, the documents clearly state that you are accepting full ownership of the assets and their associated financial obligations." Christopher looked stunned. "That wasn't explained to me." His lawyer hesitated. "It was included in the disclosure section." Christopher's gaze moved across the courtroom. For the first time, he looked at me, really looked at me, and in that moment he finally understood something. I had known all along. Christopher opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. Behind him, Kayla sat perfectly still. The confident smile she had worn earlier was gone. Because suddenly the life she believed she was stepping into looked very different. And Christopher realized, far too late, that the deal he thought he had won was never the victory he imagined. Christopher didn't speak for several seconds after the judge finished explaining the financial obligations. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier than any argument could have been. He stared down at the documents in front of him as if the numbers might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But they didn't. $2.9 million. The total remained exactly where it had always been. Christopher's lawyer leaned closer and whispered something urgently, his voice low but firm. From where I sat, I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could see the tension in his posture. Christopher shook his head slowly. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. The lawyer pointed to a specific paragraph in the agreement, tapping the paper with his finger. "You're assuming full ownership," he said quietly. "That includes the liabilities." Christopher looked up again, this time directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice suddenly less confident than before. "I didn't realize the debt was this high." The judge's expression remained neutral. "The disclosure forms were provided to both parties and their legal counsel," he said calmly. "You confirmed that you reviewed them before signing the agreement." Christopher's lawyer shifted slightly in his seat. "We did review the documentation," he admitted. The judge folded his hands on the desk. "Then the court must assume the agreement was made knowingly." Christopher looked stunned. He turned again toward his lawyer. "You told me the assets were worth over $1 million, he said quietly. "They are," the lawyer replied carefully. "But the loans, they're secured by those assets." Christopher's breathing became noticeably slower, heavier. The confidence that had carried him into the courtroom was fading rapidly. He flipped through the documents himself now, scanning the pages with increasing urgency. Mortgage balance, business loan agreements, investment credit lines. Each page added another layer of weight to the situation. Christopher stopped at the final summary page. His hands remained perfectly still for a moment. Then he whispered something under his breath. Behind him, Kayla leaned forward slightly in her seat. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. Christopher didn't respond. His lawyer finally turned toward her. "The assets carry significant financial obligations," he said cautiously. Kayla frowned. "How significant?" The lawyer hesitated. "Nearly $3 million. The number hung in the air. Kayla's eyes widened. "That's not possible." Christopher finally looked back at her. "I didn't know it was that high," he said quickly. But even as he spoke the words, they sounded less like an explanation and more like a realization. Kayla leaned back slowly in her chair. Her earlier confidence had completely disappeared. The future she had imagined walking into suddenly looked very different. Meanwhile, the judge continued reviewing the final details. "If both parties still wish to proceed with this settlement," he said, "the court will finalize the transfer of assets and associated financial responsibilities as written." Christopher's lawyer leaned close again. "We could request additional time to review this," he whispered. Christopher stared at the documents again. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. "What happens if we delay?" he asked. "We renegotiate." Christopher's eyes shifted toward me. For a moment it looked like he might say something, but then he stopped, because the truth had become impossible to ignore. If the agreement was reopened, the full extent of his financial decisions would become visible in court. The loans, the leveraged investments, the risks he had taken using shared assets as collateral. Christopher had spent years believing he was the smartest person in the room, but now the room contained lawyers, a judge, and legal documentation that told the entire story, and none of it looked favorable for him. After several seconds, Christopher lowered the papers slowly. His shoulders sagged slightly. He turned toward the judge again. "We'll proceed," he said quietly. Kayla looked at him in disbelief. "Christopher?" But he didn't look back at her, because by that point he understood something important. Stopping the agreement now would only expose him further. Continuing with it was the only way to maintain any control over the situation. The judge nodded. "Very well." He signed the final approval on the documents. "The settlement is accepted." The sound of the pen touching paper felt strangely final. Just like that, the legal transfer was complete. Christopher Carter was now the sole owner of the house, the vehicles, the rental property, and the investment accounts. He also owned every financial obligation connected to them. $2.9 million. The judge closed the file. This court recognizes the dissolution of the marriage and the agreed distribution of assets and liabilities. The hearing was over. Christopher remained seated for a moment longer. Then he slowly stood. His lawyer gathered the documents with a tense expression. Kayla rose from her seat in the back row, clearly unsure what to say. Christopher finally looked across the room at me. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation. Just the quiet shock of someone realizing the situation they believed they controlled had been very different all along. I met his gaze calmly. For 3 years I had watched him build a financial structure based on confidence and secrecy. 3 years of loans, investments, and hidden risks. Christopher believed those decisions would lead him to wealth. Instead, they had led him here, owning everything he had demanded, and everything attached to it. Without saying a word, I stood up beside Laura and walked toward the exit of the courtroom. Behind me, Christopher remained standing in the same place, still holding the documents that had just changed the course of his future. Because the moment he signed that agreement, the life he thought he had won was no longer the one he would be living. The courtroom emptied quickly after the judge finalized the settlement. Divorce hearings rarely hold anyone's attention for long. Other cases were already waiting. Other couples sitting outside in the hallway preparing for their own quiet endings. Within minutes, the room that had just decided the direction of our lives felt almost ordinary again. Christopher remained standing beside his lawyer, staring down at the stack of papers in his hands. He looked like someone who had just opened a contract written in a language he thought he understood, only to realize he had missed the most important paragraph. Kayla approached him slowly from the back row. "What does this mean?" she asked. Christopher didn't answer immediately. His lawyer spoke first. It means the asset transfer is complete. Kayla frowned. And the debt? The lawyer hesitated. It transfers with the assets. Kayla's eyes moved quickly between the two men. But that's temporary, right? She asked. Christopher still hadn't looked up. The lawyer sighed quietly. That depends on the investments. Kayla's expression tightened. What investments? Christopher finally spoke. I told you about them. You said they were opportunities. She replied quickly. They are. But his voice lacked the confidence it once carried. Kayla crossed her arms. How much debt are we talking about exactly? Christopher didn't answer. The lawyer did. Approximately $2.9 million. Kayla stared at him. That's not an opportunity. Christopher looked up sharply. Markets recover. But even as he said the words, they sounded weaker than before. Kayla shook her head slowly. You told me the house was worth nearly $1 million. It is. And the rental property. It's valuable too. But the loans. Christopher didn't respond. Kayla turned slightly, glancing toward the courtroom exit where I had walked out moments earlier. Did she know? Christopher followed her gaze. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he answered quietly, yes. The realization landed slowly. Kayla exhaled sharply. So she let you take everything? Christopher finally met her eyes. Yes. Kayla laughed once. But there was no humor in it. That's insane. Christopher shook his head. No. He understood now. What had once looked like surrender had actually been something else entirely. Patience. Outside the courthouse, Laura and I walked down the wide stone steps toward the street. The afternoon sun was bright, reflecting off the glass buildings across downtown Denver. Laura glanced at me. You're handling this remarkably well. I smiled slightly. I've had time. She nodded. That was unusual. How so? Most divorces involve long fights over who gets what. I know. But you didn't fight at all. I didn't need to. Laura looked back briefly toward the courthouse entrance. He didn't realize what he was signing. No. And you let him. Yes. Laura shook her head slowly. I've been practicing family law for 20 years, she said. I've seen people destroy each other in courtrooms. But I've never seen someone win a case by simply giving the other person exactly what they asked for. It wasn't about winning. Then what was it about? I paused at the bottom of the steps, looking out at the traffic moving slowly through the city. Clarity. Laura studied me for a moment. Then she nodded. That's one way to describe it. We walked toward the parking lot where our cars were parked. Christopher eventually emerged from the courthouse about 15 minutes later. I saw him before he saw me. He looked different now. Not broken, but quieter. The confident posture he had carried for years was gone. Kayla walked beside him. But the space between them felt larger than it had earlier that morning. They stopped near the curb while Christopher's lawyer spoke to him. I couldn't hear the conversation, but the tone looked serious. Finally, Christopher turned and noticed me standing near my car. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me. Kayla remained behind. When Christopher reached me, he stopped a few feet away. Megan. Yes. He looked like he wanted to say several things at once, but only one question came out. You knew. Yes? For how long? 3 years. Christopher let out a slow breath. So when I asked for everything, you got everything? He nodded once. There was no anger in his face. Just understanding. You could have stopped it, he said. I could have. Why didn't you? I considered the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Because you believed you deserved it. Christopher looked down briefly at the document still in his hand. Then he laughed quietly. Not bitterly. Just with the strange disbelief people feel when they finally see a situation clearly. I thought you were giving up, he said. I wasn't. He nodded slowly. I see that now. Kayla called his name from across the parking lot. Christopher glanced back toward her. When he turned back to me, the conversation felt finished. Well, he said quietly, I hope things work out for you. I opened the car door. You too. Christopher watched me for a moment longer. Then he walked back toward Kayla. I started the engine and drove away from the courthouse without looking back. The city stretched out ahead of me, bright and busy and full of possibilities. For 12 years, my life had been built around someone else's decisions. But that chapter was over now, and for the first time in a long while, the future belonged entirely to me. Life became quieter after the divorce. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. For the first few weeks, I moved into a small rental townhouse on the west side of Denver while deciding what I wanted to do next. Compared to the house Christopher now owned, the place was modest. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony, and a living room just big enough for a couch and a desk. But the silence inside it felt different. There were no late-night arguments, no phones buzzing with hidden messages, no tension in the air that made every room feel like it belonged to 2 strangers. For the first time in years, the space felt entirely mine. My career moved forward faster than I expected. Real estate had always been demanding. But after the divorce, I threw myself into the work with a focus I hadn't felt in a long time. Denver's luxury housing market was still strong, and several long-term clients began referring new buyers to me. Within a few months, I closed 3 major property deals. Each one reminded me of something important. I had never needed Christopher to succeed. About 4 months after the court hearing, I bought a new house. Not a large one, but it was exactly what I wanted. A quiet, modern home on the edge of the city with tall windows overlooking a line of pine trees. It felt calm, balanced, and intentional in a way my previous life had never quite been. The day I moved in, I stood in the empty living room for a long time just looking around. No memories attached to the walls. No old expectations. Just space. Christopher's life, however, had moved in a very different direction. I didn't follow his situation closely, but news travels quickly in small professional circles. The first rumor reached me about 6 months after the divorce. Christopher had put the house on the market. At first, I assumed it was part of a financial strategy. Selling a property can be a smart way to restructure debt. But the details that followed painted a different picture. The loans attached to the house were far heavier than the property's resale value. Several of the startup investments Christopher had funded with borrowed money had already failed. The cryptocurrency markets he had believed would surge had collapsed months earlier. Without those expected returns, the numbers didn't work. $2.9 million in debt doesn't disappear easily. A few weeks later, I heard that Kayla had moved out of the house. Apparently, the future she had imagined living there hadn't lasted very long. The last time I heard Christopher's name mentioned was almost a year after the divorce. One of my clients, who happened to work in the tech industry, casually mentioned that Christopher had left his company after dealing with significant financial pressure. He didn't know the full story. But I did. And strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction hearing about it. Revenge had never been the goal. Christopher had simply stepped into the consequences of the decisions he had already made. One quiet evening about a year and a half after the divorce, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice. Megan. Christopher sounded older somehow. Tired. How are you? He asked. I'm doing well. There was a short pause. I'm glad. Another pause followed. I know this might sound strange, he said, but I wanted to talk. What about... Christopher exhaled slowly. I wanted to say something I probably should have said a long time ago. I waited. I underestimated you, he said. The honesty in his voice surprised me. I thought you were giving up, he continued. I thought you were just letting everything go. I remember... Christopher laughed quietly. Turns out you understood the situation better than anyone. Another silence followed. I'm not calling to blame you, he said. I made my own choices. I know. I just wanted you to know that... For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Christopher asked one final question. Are you happy? I looked around my living room. The tall windows reflected the evening light outside. The quiet house felt calm in a way my life had never felt before. Yes, I said. I am Christopher seemed to accept that answer. "Well," he said softly, "I'm glad things worked out for you." "You too." The call ended a few seconds later. I set the phone down and stepped onto the balcony outside. The air was cool and quiet, the mountains barely visible in the distance beyond the city lights. For years, Christopher had believed strength meant control. Control over money, control over decisions, control over the future. But real strength isn't always about fighting for what's yours. Sometimes it's about understanding the entire game before anyone else realizes it has already begun. Christopher wanted everything. The house, the cars, the investments. So I gave him exactly what he asked for. And in doing that, I walked away with something far more valuable: freedom. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the quiet strength of patience, then you already know how powerful that moment can be. And if this story made you think about the difference between revenge and wisdom, let me know in the comments. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the strongest move isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's simply stepping back and letting the truth reveal itself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and stay with the channel for more stories about hidden strength, unexpected justice, and the quiet moments when everything finally turns around. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.